There comes a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes quietly earned, when you realize that telling the truth about how you feel doesn't always bring closeness, that honesty doesn't always lead to intimacy, because some people don't hear vulnerability as trust. They hear it as information, as leverage, and you didn't learn this from books or theories. You learned it from experience, from watching your most human confessions turn into weapons later, from seeing your softness remembered not to protect you, but to control you. And you didn't become guarded because you're cold or manipulative. You became guarded because you were studied, because every insecurity became a pressure point. Every emotional truth became something that could be used against you. So now, you hesitate before speaking. You soften your words. You explain yourself too carefully or retreat into silence. And here's the core paradox. The very sensitivity that once made you deeply human became the reason you were unsafe. Not because vulnerability is wrong, but because it was given to the wrong psychology. Because narcissistic personalities do not bond through mutual vulnerability. They bond through advantage, through emotional asymmetry, through power, and while they may understand your feelings intellectually, they do not feel responsible for them emotionally, which is why your pain was never held, only noticed, only stored, only reused. And if you grew up around emotional unpredictability, your nervous system likely adapted through hypervigilance, learning to scan for shifts, anticipate moods, regulate others before yourself, making you empathetic and perceptive, but also dangerously transparent. Because narcissists are drawn to people who radiate attunement since it gives them what they cannot generate internally. And if you were parentified, forced to manage emotions too early, you learned that love was earned through emotional availability rather than safety. So you revealed yourself quickly, explained yourself deeply, softened first, believing openness created closeness, when in reality it created access. And the emotional cost of this lesson runs deeper than heartbreak, because over time you begin editing your truth before speaking, minimizing your needs to avoid retaliation, confusing intimacy with emotional surrender, and slowly, quietly, your authenticity becomes negotiable. Not because you don't know who you are, but because you learned that being fully seen came with consequences, creating a grief that's rarely named, the grief of the self that once spoke freely, that didn't calculate tone or outcome, that didn't associate honesty with danger. A grief Carl Jung hinted at when he said that accepting oneself completely is terrifying, because for survivors of narcissistic dynamics, the fear isn't self-acceptance, it's self-exposure. And this conditioning follows you into adulthood in subtle patterns, craving intimacy but fearing visibility, attracting emotionally dominant partners because familiarity feels like gravity, over-explaining boundaries instead of asserting them, tolerating exploitative authority at work, intellectualizing emotions instead of expressing them, staying composed under pressure only to collapse privately, confusing usefulness with worth, shape-shifting so fluently you forget which version is real. But none of these are flaws. They are intelligent survival strategies formed in unsafe emotional environments. And the tragedy isn't that they existed, it's that they stayed long after the danger passed, because survival is not the same as living, and what once protected you may now be what's keeping you small. Which is why healing does not mean becoming reckless with vulnerability or permanently closed off. It means becoming discerning, asking not, how do I explain myself better, but who has earned access to my inner world. Because the truth narcissists never want you to realize is that your vulnerability is not your weakness. Indiscriminate vulnerability is, and your discernment is your power. And healing begins when your nervous system learns to recognize safety instead of performing for it. When you do inner child work to restore choice, shadow work to integrate anger rather than suppress it. Softness not as exposure, but as self-respect, because strength is not secrecy and softness is not surrender. It is agency. And as Jung warned, until the unconscious is made conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But you are not broken. You were trained, and training can be undone, not by hardening or disappearing, but by choosing where your truth belongs. Because the goal is not to be fixed. The goal is to become whole.